Recently, I've been reflecting on what it means to think like a philosopher and how to shift from being someone whose thinking is very unphilosophical to being a philosophical thinker. And this shift I have in mind really does come down to ways of thinking. One thing I found people sometimes don't realize about being a philosopher is that it's not so much about what kinds of facts you know, or what books you've read, or what educational credentials you have. First and foremost, it's about your way of thinking, your way of engaging with intellectual questions. And so here are what I see as the key changes to make this shift to thinking like a philosopher. The first is to understand the possibility that you are mistaken. Acknowledge that your view might be incorrect, even if it's a view you hold strongly. This recognition is especially important when it comes to issues where experts disagree, and more generally, issues where it's common for reasonable, intelligent people to disagree. Some examples of issues like this include the existence of God, or the moral status of abortion or euthanasia, or how far freedom of speech should extend. If you find yourself thinking that the answers to these issues are obvious, pause and consider. If that were the case, would so many intelligent people, including experts, disagree about what the answers are? Almost certainly not. So that is the first and perhaps most foundational shift in one's thinking here, the shift to embracing at least that minimum degree of intellectual humility. A second shift involved in becoming a philosophical thinker is to ask yourself, for a given view of yours, what evidence it'd take to convince you that the view is mistaken. If the answer is nothing, then your view is unfalsifiable. There's nothing, even in principle, that you would take to show that it's false. Now, it might not be obvious why this is a problem rather than a strength, but the trouble is that an unfalsifiable view makes no predictions about what we should expect reality to be like. For a toy example, take the view that unicorns roam the forests of the world. This view leads to certain predictions. That is, there's evidence that we'd expect to find if the view were true. And this evidence includes, for example, people seeing unicorns when they go to visit the forest, or taking photos of unicorns, or finding the distinctive skeletons or other remains from unicorns that have passed away. Were we to observe these things, that'd be at least some evidence that there really are unicorns roaming around. And this is more generally how we accumulate evidence for a view. The view tells us what reality should be like if it's true, and then we observe whether reality is in fact that way. And conversely, the fact that we don't observe any unicorns or unicorn remains or any other evidence suggesting the presence of unicorns in the places where we'd expect to find them, were they to exist, is evidence that there are not, in fact, unicorns. So far, so good. But now suppose that someone tries to get around this by stipulating that unicorns are invisible and that they leave no trace of their existence. Well, now the view has become unfalsifiable, such that the fact that we don't observe unicorns is no longer evidence against their existence. But consider, is there any evidence for such a view? Could there be evidence for it? No, because the view no longer makes any predictions. There's a broader lesson here, which is that if you're unwilling to count anything, even in principle, as evidence against a given view, then you can't count anything as evidence in favor of it either. Rationally, philosophically, scientifically, the view becomes useless. So for any view you have, make sure that you have at least some possible evidence in mind that could change your view. And when you have that possible disconfirming evidence in mind, seek it out. Try to find out whether that evidence does in fact exist. To the extent that you make a genuine effort to find this disconfirming evidence, but find that it's not there, that helps you be more rational in maintaining your view than you'd otherwise be. And as you go about looking for a disconfirming evidence, one thing to keep in mind is that it helps to talk with those who disagree with you, or to read works by those who disagree with you. Don't just have conversations with those who already agree with you, and don't just read or watch sources that already agree with you. Focusing your efforts solely on finding evidence in support of your view is a trap known as confirmation bias, and it's a very easy trap to fall into. But thinking like a philosopher requires us to move beyond confirmation bias and instead focus on marshaling all the evidence against our views that we can, to see if our views can withstand the challenge. On that note, a further crucial shift on the path to becoming a philosophical thinker is to understand that there's no shame in updating your view in response to evidence. It's common to find it embarrassing to change your mind about something, as if it must mean that you're not very smart. But being willing to change your mind in response to evidence is in fact one of the truest signs of intelligence. Those who go the other way and who refuse ever to update their views in response to new evidence are in fact the ones being unintelligent, the ones who are embracing the path of dogmatism rather than philosophical thinking. Closely related point here is that when you face a new challenge to your view, you don't have to always have a response immediately ready. It's okay to say that you don't know, and to take some time to think about it. After all, philosophy is hard. It features some of the most challenging, foundational, perennial questions that humanity has ever faced. When it's at its best, philosophy is something done slowly and carefully, and not with a sense of pressure to always immediately know the perfect thing to say when confronted with challenges. I'd now like to turn to a different element of thinking like a philosopher, which is to be wary of slogan-based thinking. Some examples of slogans I have in mind, ones that have often had a large influence on people's thought, are slogans like, "The personal is political," "Import the third world, become the third world," "God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve," "My body, my choice." These are pithy statements that gesture at fuller arguments and even worldviews, but the trouble with slogans is that they often end up replacing deeper thought or debate on the issues that they're about. To be clear, this is not to say that no slogan ever points in the direction of truth. However, if you find that your thinking on a given issue immediately reverts again and again to slogans, such that the slogans seem to be the real focus, as opposed to more developed arguments, that's a sign that your thought on the issue is not very informed, and that you could stand to approach the issue more carefully. A further part of thinking like a philosopher, a part whose importance I cannot overstate, is to be willing to entertain hypotheticals. That is, it's crucial to be able to think counterfactually and to see the value in thought experiments. By thought experiments, I mean hypothetical, and sometimes even far out or fanciful scenarios that are meant to raise questions or press a point or to gauge our intuitions about something. For example, suppose someone makes the extreme claim that committing any violence against anyone could never be justified. Now, someone else might come along and challenge this with a thought experiment. They might say, well, what if you had to slap someone, say, to save 1 billion lives? And this is indeed a challenge to the first person's view here, because their view commits them to saying that even in this circumstance, where 1 billion lives are on the line, you would not be justified in simply giving a slap to someone else. And that's just not the intuitive verdict, at least not for many or most people. Now, the first person, the very committed pacifist here, might try to disarm the thought experiment by simply refusing to engage with it. They might say, oh, that's a ridiculous scenario. That wouldn't ever happen. But they can't simply dismiss the thought experiment in this way. In this example, remember that the claim they started with is that there's no circumstance in which any violence against anyone would be justified. That's a view that has implications about various hypothetical circumstances, including the hypothetical circumstance of having to choose between slapping one person and letting 1 billion lives be lost. The fact that the thought experiment is fanciful is just not relevant. What matters is that the view on the table gives an intuitively unpalatable verdict about what one's obligations in such a scenario would be. And in that way, the thought experiment gives evidence against the view. So while it can be tempting to dismiss an unusual or far-out thought experiment, especially when you sense that engaging with the thought experiment might reveal a challenge to your view, you should nevertheless be willing to engage with thought experiments. Now, a further shift in thinking like a philosopher has to do with moments when you encounter people who disagree with you. In those moments, be curious about the reasons why they disagree with you. Let this curiosity be your first and primary reaction, rather than immediately taking offense, or becoming annoyed, or criticizing the other. And here I think it's important not to take others' views and arguments personally, or to become offended by them, even if they're criticizing a behavior that you yourself engage in, or a belief that you yourself hold strongly. For example, maybe someone is arguing that there's a duty to vote, and you yourself don't vote. Or maybe someone is arguing that God doesn't exist, all the while your own belief in God is important to your identity. Part of the reason not to be offended from encounters like these is that there's an important difference between a person's beliefs or behaviors on one hand, and that individual themselves as a person on the other. For someone to criticize a belief or behavior that you happen to have doesn't mean that they're rejecting or condemning you as a person. And even if, for whatever reason, they do intend to cast aspersions on you as a person, that person's opinion is generally not something worth getting worked up about. For one thing, getting riled up about it is more likely to cloud than to help your thinking. On that note, another important element of thinking like a philosopher is to be extra inclined to question your views when you notice that the issue is something you feel strong emotions about. For it's all too easy in cases like this to let your views be guided more by emotions than by reason. Emotions, especially when they're emotions like anger, have a way of hijacking the mind and making it more difficult to reason effectively. This doesn't mean that you can't ever have beliefs about things you feel strongly about. The key is simply to be appropriately careful and tentative. For instance, one good rule of thumb is that the more emotional you feel about a given debate, the more carefully you should make sure that you're properly and charitably engaging with the views of those who disagree with you, and not simply dismissing caricatures that your emotions have led you to conjure up. A final element I'd like to touch on when it comes to thinking like a philosopher is to refrain from thinking in terms of who's right about a given debate, or which side is right, or whom to side with. This kind of framing can reinforce a certain tribalism or groupthink, having your views be subject to pressure to agree with those you perceive as being your allies. Instead, try to think more simply in terms of what views are right, what the evidence is, and so on. In a similar way, realize that you can agree with someone on some things while disagreeing with them on other things, even highly important things. No person or group has a monopoly on truth. And just about anyone, no matter how wrong-headed we might feel they are in general, has something that we can learn from. Of course, there's much more that could be said about all of these points. This is just a quick snapshot for now. But I do believe that if you put all of these ways of thinking into practice, you'll have achieved the most crucial elements of thinking like a philosopher. If you have any thoughts or questions about these ways of thinking, let me know in the comments. Also, if you're interested in learning more about philosophy, and especially if you're approaching the subject for the first time, but aren't sure where to start, you might like this video, where I give some advice on ways of learning philosophy that are the most effective.